And then, as I said yesterday, social media exacerbates that problem because we've now got macroeconomic experts on every Twitter feed who aren't economists. No, that's not necessarily a good thing if the concepts are misused, and so we get a non-educated process going. And then over the top of all of that, then we have ideological agendas manipulating concepts and abusing those concepts for their own ends. We're going to have to sort of have a sit-in, I think, and I'm not sure whether we can get more chairs in there. But quite welcome to sort of sit around.
So isn't there a conference room right outside?
Yeah, it'd be good to get some more chairs, and I'll go slower until you come back. And so what this work the proposition that I have is that we have in this talk is that the success of the neoliberal agenda is not at the evidence-based level, because it fails dramatically at that level. It's at the level of framing and language. And it's somehow been able to persuade the general population that its defunct concepts and frameworks are legitimate. It's getting. We might have to go out on the lawn and do it properly. Yeah, we might have to go and sort of getting like a love-in, isn't it?
Not yet.
You want to see the cucumber?
I think we need free market to the side.
I don't know.
Yeah, if ever.
If the first 4 rows would move up about 3 feet, you can make another row in the back.
Now it's really fun.
No, I'm okay.
Yeah.
Wow, it is.
One more, a little bit further front, one more to squeeze in. I don't know who this is.
We have your autograph.
No.
Anybody's water?
So can we all cope? Hey Randy, is there another room that we go to? Okay, it looks like the flow has stopped. So we okay? All right. So the argument is that the dominant agenda, the neoliberal agenda, is basically fails at evidence-based level. It's what Lakatosh would have called a degenerative paradigm, but it's highly successful because of the way it frames itself and the way it resonates and exploits our cognitive capacities, the way we learn and think about things and try to understand our realities. The neoliberal agenda has been able to recruit those processes better than the progressive agenda. And so the question that I've had for years has been, well, look, this is so self-evident to me, all this stuff. yet it doesn't cut through. So why is that? And that led me into all of this work with Louisa. And the proposition is that our side of the argument has failed to gain traction because there's two problems. One is that these economic concepts are not well understood, so that's an education issue. So, and that's a lot of our program over the last 25 years has been to write stuff to educate, but also that's not sufficient because that has to interact with the use of the way in which we can reverse these pervasive cultural metaphors that the neoliberals exploit to support these policy interventions that effectively work against those who are the most vehement supporters. I mean, I just couldn't believe the Tea Party movement in the US. The most vehement supporters of an agenda that was undermining their own prosperity. And they didn't even know it. And that's because of the way in which framing and language is used. So here's one vision of the economy. So first of all, we've got to have an idea of what a vision is and what we're aiming to achieve. And this is what I call a neoliberal vision. And this is the idea that... Have you got a pointer here even? Oh gosh. I turned it off, sorry. Pointer. Yeah, there. So this is the idea that the people on the planet, us and the natural system we sit in, is somehow just a servant to this thing that's separate from us called the economy. And so the overall framing and narrative that's been used over the free market period has built this sort of individualistic framework where the economy is sort of like a deity, and that it's a deity that's alive. It gets sick, and it gets sick because we do bad things to it, like try to regulate it, or try to provide minimum wages, try to intervene in its natural operations. So there's all of this terminology, natural rates of unemployment. That's in the literature, as if unemployment's natural, and that this thing, if it's left alone, is self-governing, it's self-regulating, and if it's left to self-regulate, it will maximise the benefits and the wealth creation for all of us. That's the narrative, and that when it gets sick, it's because we've done something bad to it. We haven't sacrificed enough, or we've imposed things that are bad for it. And anybody who's left behind in this economy must be a miscreant, must have something wrong with them. And so the victim of a systemic failure to create enough jobs is actually turned into being the criminal, the culprit. That's one vision, and that's the dominant vision. And so you'll hear a lot of metaphors used in the public debate about pulling tightening your belt and all of these things, and they're all related to this vision. An alternative vision, which I call a progressive vision, which then will inspire a totally different set of frames and language to reinforce that vision, is this one, where we're intrinsically embedded in our planet, and if the planet suffers, then we're going to ultimately suffer. And that the economy here isn't independent of us, it is us, and should only be used to help us. We don't serve the economy serves us. That's a different frame. That in the previous thing, see, we're serving the economy, the planet's a servant of the economy. It's not seen as something as an objective that we should be worried about other than just extracting and using. Whereas this frame sees us embedded in the planet, and so the planet's health is our health and well-being, and that the economy is nothing natural about it. We created it, we can control it, and we can divert it and make it work to our benefit. And the other part of this vision then is that, well, what's the role of the government? Well, the government's only our agent. Mostly we don't want government because it's annoying. But sometimes the government is the only way in which we can advance our general well-being as our agent. It's us. It's not something separate from us. And it's more importantly, it's not a moral arbiter to be punishing those who don't sacrifice enough. So all of these punitive policies that punish the unemployed, your Clinton reforms, and in Australia, we have really vicious treatment of our unemployed, who deign to put their heads up to get below poverty line income support. The cheek of them doing that. And so this vision prompts us and demands from us that we define what we want this economy to do for us. And that requires us to advance a concept which we call public purpose. And so if the economy isn't if our policy structures aren't advancing what we define to our destination, then there's something wrong. It's not wrong, it's not something we're doing, we're not getting this to work for us in a proper way. And so the sphere of the economic debate always has to be what we're trying to achieve. For those who are familiar with this literature, this will be passe and boring, I'm very sorry. For those who aren't, we'll go through it quickly. When we talk about a framing or a frame, we're talking about a conceptual structure that's used in thinking. So those two diagrams are conceptual structures that force us to think about the objects within the diagrams. And metaphors and frames are intrinsically linked, and metaphors are used to reinforce Now, just a brief example before we go on. And we've talked in the last few days about tax cuts, and there was more in the session just before. And so you get a progressive frame says tax cuts for the rich. Sorry, no tax cuts for the rich. That's a progressive frame, no tax cuts for the rich. Yet, what we know from cognitive linguistics is that as soon as you put the no before that statement, you're reinforcing it. And I'll explain why. And so what happens regularly is that progressives talk about taxes that permit spending on other good things. They think they're being progressive. Yet what they're really doing when they say no tax cuts for the rich is reinforcing tax cuts for the rich because of the metaphorical way in which we construe things. So we'll try to delve into that. So quite often in the public debate, progressives are trying to do the right thing, yet because they don't understand this stuff, they actually reinforce the conservative frame. Now this is more Louise's area than mine, so I'm just the mouthpiece. And the three basic principles of cognitive linguistics are that the way that our mind is inherently embodied, and what that means is that there is a linking and a centrality of physical and perceptual systems in the way we learn and understand things. And so you ally that then with the second point, that is most of our thinking is unconscious. We actually don't know we're doing it. And we often, we don't think in logical, or in sort of, you do philosophy 101, you learn logic. That's not the way we think. And quite often we hold at the same time views that are inconsistent, yet we don't know it. And that's a real problem. And so, for example, these abstract concepts have physical presence through metaphorical use. So, for example, we understand the concept of more or less, or good or bad, in terms of a physical manifestation, like up is more or good, and down is bad or less. So when someone triggers what is called the more is up metaphor, then they're triggering a response that's a good thing happening. And what George Lakoff says is our brains are structured by hundreds of metaphors and frames very early in our lives. And what the discipline of marketing, you learn, teaches marketers to exploit these frames, mostly which are unconscious in our. Now, the other thing to note, there's this thing called construal, and that gives you hope, because what that means, what that relates to, is that we can actually we've got this body of metaphorical information and awareness from early on in our lives, but we can adapt to new ways of framing and new use of language. We can construe things differently if we're confronted with different things. So for progressives to learn this stuff, we can alter the debate by using a different set of frames and different language through construal processes within human consciousness. And so in other words, we have the capacity to construe the same information in different ways through different ways of expression. And that's what the hope for progressive economics is, to exploit that construal capacity to reverse the neoliberal frame. Now, mainstream macro maintains its dominance through this series of interlinked myths. And we heard a lot of them this morning. As Stephanie said, how are you going to afford it? You're going to borrow. Therefore, the borrowing is going to impose intolerable burdens on our grandchildren. Blah blah. There's a series of interlinked myths. If the government borrows, it pushes up interest rates. Interest rates choke off private investment. Private investment is more efficient than public investment. Therefore, borrowing's bad. All of this stuff. And those myths, theoretical myths, in the economics literature that I just mentioned, I could name stacks, are then reinforced through the use of metaphors that deliberately exploit our vulnerability to framing and language. And these metaphors have one purpose only, and that's to explicitly advance an ideological attack on the use of government's fiscal policy in the areas that I've talked. So what are they? Let's have an example. Here's a table, and we're not going to go through the whole table, just an example. So, and some of these might be culturally specific, because some of them are used in the Australian political process more, or maybe they're not used here as much, but I think they are. So, our former Prime Minister, who got dumped by his own party in relation to, focus and attack here, metaphorical claim what they're really trying to mean here in the third column. So our former Prime Minister used to say, when he was in opposition, the government is spending like a drunken sailor. Well, what's that triggering? That's triggering wanton, irresponsible and delinquent behaviour. And that's the way that metaphorical relationship between government spending and a drunken sailor. There's no relationship, of course. It's metaphorical, but it triggers a bad response. Nation has maxed out its credit card, and that's experiencing to. Is that used over here?
Yes.
That's triggering on our personal experience, which has no relevance at all to the government's fiscal capacity, but it's triggering that if we max out our credit card, that means we've run out of money due to irresponsible spending. And I could go on, we talk about budget black holes. Do you do that over here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so, if you're talking about some astral capacity, that it's beyond human control, like a massive collapse of a massive star. And it's all of those things. There's there's nothing of substance there, but it's triggering the way in which we construct the reality, and in a specific way. The nation's bankrupt, and it's a badly managed insolvent firm, and so on and so forth. And relevant to the second point here, relevant to this morning's thing, a lot of progressives get locked into the same language. And when I've confronted progressive political leaders, they tell me, "Oh, well, we've got to use that language because that's real politics. That if we don't know, we've got to debate it within the language of the Congress over here." And all they're doing is reinforcing that they're just lining up behind the conservatives that they're wanting to oppose. Now, these are the significant ways in which the neoliberals use these frames to get their ideological agenda. So the government faces the same budget constraint as a household, and I've got budgeted in quotes for reasons I'll explain in a minute. And the reality, what that's doing is that framing is appealing to our intrinsic experience and intuition, because we've got really detailed understanding of our own household budgets and what it means and how we've got to get money and we've got to go out and work or run down our savings or sell assets or borrow to spend. And we've got really detailed understanding, most of us, particularly those who are working, of what happens when we max out our credit card, and what happens when we can't afford to pay a bill, and things like that. But the point is that the analogies at the most elemental level is inapplicable. And there's nothing about our personal budgeting experience that has any relevance at all to the fiscal capacity of the federal government, of the national government, to issues its own currency. And so an alternative narrative with alternative framing has to, and this is one of the things we've been on about for years, has to always talk about the special characteristics of the government's currency. Here's another one, that fiscal deficits are bad and fiscal surpluses are good. Well, that's totally false. But it's all of those metaphors that I had on that table. Some of them are constantly used to inculcate in our perception that fiscal deficits are bad, and progressives might tolerate them for a little while, but then you've got to rush back in surplus as quickly as possible. And of course, the conservatives don't like deficits ever. Now, where did you get the idea that a deficit? See, a deficit implies a shortage. A shortage is more is up. The opposite to more is up metaphor is bad. A deficit is the opposite of more is up, which is good. Deficit's bad because it's the opposite. That's where we get it from. The use of the word deficit, shortfall. It's bad to be short. there's an abundance, plentiful. Sounds good. Yet in the context of a macroeconomy, a surplus might be the best thing, but it might be the worst thing. It depends upon, the other sectors, what the other sectors are doing. So Norway, for example, has very high level of provision of public infrastructure, has quite a high private domestic saving rate overall, and has a very strong net exports surplus. So in that case, to stop pressures on the economy overheating, it has to run a surplus, a fiscal surplus. So in that context, of all of those conditions being satisfied, the fiscal surplus is okay. In the context of Australia at the moment, I think with 14 or 15 or 16% labour resources underutilised, the fact that the government is trying to run a fiscal surplus is a disaster. It's a delinquent action. So we've got to try to relate then the fiscal situation with the context when we use our framing language. Because sometimes deficits will be bad, sometimes bad in the context, and sometimes they'll be okay and essential. And we also should never, and I'll come back to it, never escape the fact that a fiscal deficit adds to net financial assets in the non-government sector, adds to our financial wealth, and a fiscal surplus destroys non-government financial wealth. And so once you relate it through a causal train so intrinsically, I use the word deficit, intrinsically we think that's bad. But then if you relate that to what it actually does, increase our net financial assets in the non-government sector, well then increasing wealth is always good. So it's a matter of how you relate these concepts. And I've just mentioned that. And here's the important point. Note that I never use the word budget deficit or budget surplus. And the reason is because as soon as I use that language, I'm triggering the household budget analogy. Every time I say budget, we think household budget. So a progressive language should stop using that when relating to the fiscal balance of the government. And I'll leave that. The government will run out of fiscal space or go broke. Well, the Greek government might go broke. Why? Because it uses a foreign currency, doesn't it? The euro. But the American government can't go broke unless it deliberately wants to. The Australian government can never run out of money unless it deliberately defaults. And so whenever we're talking about fiscal space and what the fiscal opportunities of the government, national currency issue government are, a progressive should never talk in terms of financial ratios, because debt to GDP ratios and deficit to GDP. That's now liberal type framing, because it's somehow saying that those ratios are important. Well, they're just measurement artefacts of some action that's been taken, that's done something. So what's that action that's done something? What is it? Well, presumably if the government's acting on our behalf, it's a good thing. And the financial ratios that are just a measuring, it's just an after-the-fact accounting statement with no operational value, with no particular importance. And so progressives should always talk about fiscal space in terms of the real resource space that's available. In other words, the US government can buy anything that's for sale in US dollars without question. Whether it wants to is a separate issue, but in a financial sense it can. And so the debate has to then go not whether it can or it can't, not whether the debt to GDP ratio would do this or that. It's, well, why would it buy something in US dollars? What's it going to do with it? That's where the framing and debate should be. Our mind should be focused. So I'll come back to that. Fiscal deficits lead to big government. I mean, this is another one. Well, no, they don't necessarily. And the size of the government is a political choice. We've got to understand that the political system determines how big government or small is in relation to the general economy. And an additional point of that is that even if you've got a tiny government as a percentage of your overall economy, it's still likely to have to run a deficit if the non-government sector wants to save overall. And I'm not talking just about household saving here, I'm talking about the overall saving. It doesn't matter what size the government is, the principles of sectoral balances still operate. You don't eliminate deficits if you reduce the size of government. Alright, so what we believe we've achieved in the 25 years of working together is what probably about that, Warren, you and I have been working with. About 94, 93. What we've achieved is we believe we've got it now an internally consistent and empirically consistent, robust set of principles about macroeconomics. The logic is internally consistent and it stands up empirically impeccably. That's what we would say we've achieved so far. But that's only a really tiny step. Yeah.
Nobody else can even explain the past. Never mind forecast.
Yeah. Well, the example I use is Japan.
Yeah. Exception. No, they're an exception.
Yeah. Cultural.
Cultural.
But we've only made a tiny progress because we haven't transported that internally consistent, empirically robust system into the awareness of the population who determine through the voting systems the policy choices. And our task, in my view now, and this is why I started working with Louisa on this stuff, our task is then to frame a progressive macroeconomics narrative that's based upon the MMT framework that we've been building that can overcome the neoliberal frame. Now, this is an important point, I think, is that MMT, a lot of people say to me, oh, MMT is left-wing. And my response is, well, no, it's not. It's a lens through which you understand the operations of the monetary system. But to give that operation any context or sense, you've then got to impose a value system on it. So an extreme right-winger could live comfortably talking MMT, just as an extreme left-winger could. They would use the policy capacity of the fiscal agent, the government, in a totally different way. But they would understand what they're doing. Whereas now they don't even understand what they're doing. And so what I'll talk about in the last several slides is that my policy value preferences are collective, not individual. And I won't say left or right, but I believe in the value of the collective, and that's why I think full employment is important. You can make up your mind where on the political spectrum that sits. So what we studying all of this stuff, you learn in developing a strategy for communication, which is what all this framing and metaphorical stuff is about. The first point you understand is you'll never win an argument starting from facts. So it's, I think in the past we've tried to do that. We've tried to explain why MMT is an impeccably rigorous system of thought. The mainstream economists can't explain Japan. Can't. Huge deficits, relatively, zero interest rates, fighting deflation, 3 or 4% unemployment, the biggest real estate crash in history in 91, yet they had 1/4 of negative GDP growth. How do you explain all that? So the point is that you can never start the argument and the reframe by appealing to facts. They'll never do it because you're always coming up against the resistant frame that's repelling those facts. The starting point has to be to define some social purpose and aspirations, because we resonate with that sort of language. You know, we want our communities safe. We want our children to have opportunities. Those sort of frames. What do we want the economy to do for us? That should be the way we start a conversation and a program of discussion. And that reverses the idea that if our government interferes in the natural state, the economy will get sick. We start reversing that idea that the government's evil and something unnatural. We're saying, what do we want the economy to do for us? It is us. We want it to work for us. And the articulation of the facts come later. So, for example, here's an example of, in New Zealand there was a mayor's task force for jobs. The local government's mayors got sick to death of the national government running austerity programs during the 1990s. And so the mayors took it on themselves, even though they didn't have any currency power. They just said, well, we're going to try to do something about the terrible youth unemployment that's been created. And they had a slogan, zero wasted New Zealanders. And it was an incredibly powerful statement of social purpose that everybody could relate to. And they had another one, our youth, our future. That's a broad social aspiration. It's nothing about facts, it's just a statement of social purpose that everybody can relate to. But the other thing we know in cognition is that motherhood statements are not going to get you anything. They're motherhood statements because they have to be associated with concrete actions to trigger the right cognitive responses. And this is where we invoke what are called event causation structures and link them to associated metaphorical language. So we want an event, zero wasted New Zealanders, or we need a causation structure to get that, and metaphors to support that process. And for example, here's jobs for all. How many politicians from every side of politics says we want jobs for all? Well, everybody could agree with that. But then the next line, the Conservatives will say, free markets will grow the economy and create jobs. They're supporting the jobs for all. And then they use metaphors to say how the free market does that, and the government doesn't do that. So what we need, so this is the event, and this is the conservative causation. So what progressives have to do is have an appropriate action to support that social purpose. And so we might say, well, we want jobs for all, but that means we have to have aggregate demand rising by X% to generate Y million jobs. So in the same sentence as the purpose, we're adding a causation structure that reflects the underlying reality that MMT supports. So the event is jobs for all, the causation structure is government deficits. It leads people in the direction that we want them to go, in understanding. And away from the jobs for all, free markets provide jobs narrative. And the problem of a lot of progressive narratives is that we get just lost in these value statements all the time. We have all of these motherhood statements that are written, but no purpose, event, causation, action statements, which we have. And so the task for people interested in this stuff is to help politicians and advocates develop these structures with appropriate language. So the challenge is that we need to better educate the public in macroeconomics. We're doing that, I hope. And then we need to develop this language and frames. Okay, so here are some examples just in the last several slides. There's this concept that purposes are destinations. So when we say jobs for all, we're wanting to get somewhere. And the way we think in cognitive terms, in metaphorical terms, in terms of purposes, is we think in terms of getting somewhere. We think in terms of destinations, going somewhere. And that's the intrinsic frame that's associated with a purpose. Well, we've got a purpose, we want to go somewhere. So thinking about that, then we want to define what the destination is in terms of progressive outcome and frame rather than a neoliberal frame. So rather than define the destination as some fiscal outcome, we want to define it in terms of, say, a people outcome. So when the government says it's going to create, spend, and I'll come back to the word spend in a moment, spend X million dollars, the next statement shouldn't have anything to do with what that will add to the fiscal balance or what. It should be that it will do this for people. The destination of the spending is for people, whereas the neoliberal destination is always back into financial outcomes. And so it's pointless for us to get locked into elaborate debates about whether the deficit's going to go up or what size it's going to be. Forget it. Those sort of discussions are not going to help us. They just reinforce these frames about sacrifice. And so we've got to always be pointing to desired objects that relate directly to the intrinsic frames we're attempting to motivate. So, for example, if we just had the statement government spent X million dollars, that immediately invokes a negative response. Spent, it's gone. When we go for a run, we come home and say, "Gee, I'm spent." That means we're exhausted. It's all gone. All our energy's gone. Whereas if we say government invested X million dollars to enhance our purposes, whatever they might be, well then we're exploiting the more is up metaphor, for example, which is an intrinsic frame which we think is good. Because invest means building up. We intrinsically relate to that it's a good thing, rather than using up spend. And government budget, note I've got it in commas there, is X% of GDP. Well, the more is up metaphor, which is normally good, also works in reverse. And so deficit equals bad. So the budget triggers the household, and the use of the word budget triggers the household metaphor. So it's a combination of understanding what the intrinsic frames we're using and the language we use to relate those frames. A couple more examples. So here's an example of how we can link the language and the metaphor. Following on, government deficit rose. Fact. If we left it at that, we've triggered a bad response and generated higher levels of wealth for households and firms, which MMT tells you will be the case. And so we've gone from an event through a causal structure to a destination that's good. And so we've reversed the negative frame and the negative response to the deficit concept. We can reverse that to take you to a good destination. And the more we say those things, the more the response will become favourable to the sort of things we want. And the other sorts of generalised metaphors are causes are forces and causation is forced. That's the way we think. We think of a cause as something that's a force, and that causation has to be therefore forced. Something has to happen for a cause to create an event. And so in this example here, we learn that the government action, what's the government action? It's running the deficit. What does that do? Well, it forces movement towards higher levels of wealth and for households and firms. And that forces movement towards a desired destination by just using careful language and linking things together in that way. And we also, that triggers an understanding in our cognition that if there is no force, there will be no movement and we won't get to the destination. And so we just continually reinforcing that we've got to get to this destination with social purpose. And the way in which we get to that destination is through the deficit. And we're linking them, and people are then starting to understand that if we don't do that, we won't get there. They'll be ringing up their politicians, crank that up. Okay, so this is too complicated, but this is just a comparison of that previous table with a progressive way of thinking about the same things. And if anyone wants the slideshow, or this table, I can send it to you. We've gone long enough to get to volume. I'll leave that. Oh, there's this concept called untellable truths. And this is where the political process gets so locked into groupthink that even if the politicians know something is true, it's like what you said, I can't say that. The politician understands it, but they can't say it. I had a meeting with had a meeting with the leader of the Australian Marines, who's now retired, was a very decent chap. We had a long conversation and I explained all this stuff to him. And he said, well, I can't say that. I'd rather go along with the neoliberal frame on fiscal policy and spending so that I neutralise that part of the political debate so I can concentrate and advance my social and green agenda. And I said to him, yeah, but by going along with the austerity frame, you haven't got the resources to advance your social and climate change policy. But he didn't get that bit. But it's this idea of the untellable truth that politicians are just not going to. They know something, but they fear if they say it, they're shot. So we need to help them with that. The work ahead in this project is that a handbook of progressive language. So sort of like you get a book on how to fix your own car, on those manuals. I used to have them, but I can't use them. Cars are too complicated. But a handbook of progressive language to help people learn. We've got to all go back to primary school and become literate again in a new language and a new way of framing. It's as basic as that. We can be as elaborate of understanding of our macroeconomy as MMT is. But unless we can communicate it through these cognitive processes, forget it. That's the challenge. And, as I said in that earlier forum, the right, the Conservatives got this really early. And they developed these think tanks in the 70s that just pump out stuff that exploits all these metaphors and intrinsic frames all the time. They've been so much ahead of it than us, and that's where we've got to go. And the first thing we can do to finish is never use the word budget in relation to a government fiscal balance. All right, so
What's
that's
a
just
good
an
word to
advertisement.
use there?
Okay, that's it. Sorry.
What's a good word to use?
I don't know who's. I'm moderating the session, I guess. What's our timing? That's the question.
Someone had a question. What do you use instead of the budget?
I use fiscal, so we've got to midday. We've got 25 minutes. I use the word fiscal. I'm a work in progress because I make mistakes too. I still use government spending. And one of the problems, here's a problem with that specific example. And it's I remember when I was a young student, reading about Harrod's fights with Keynes over chapter 2, where Keynes thought he could make an argument. Randy talked about it yesterday, where Keynes thought it was better to use the sort of framework of the neoclassical, the conservative free market argument at the time, and then vary it a little bit because you were talking their language and using their concepts to show that they were wrong. And this is and Harrod said that wasn't a good idea because I think he was proved right, that it basically allowed Keynes to be ignored. And so the question is, how far do you create your own language? Because sort of when you're in Spain, you've got to speak Spanish, that's clear. So investment means something quite specific in economics. It doesn't mean government spending, it means any spending that creates productive capacity. So when you're trying to reinvent a new language, you don't want to also create dissonance in understanding. That's a problem, and I'm still trying to work all this out myself. I'm a baby as well as all of us.
Your friend, I love, the late-minded average person, they don't even know what this is.
Yeah, so there's lots of education.
Yeah.
I said the challenge was education plus all this language and framing. They're interlinked.
So, I'm one of those media people. I have a podcast every week, and I talk about MMT. And I explain something almost every week. And one of the things that I keep saying over and over again is, it's not the job of the federal government to balance the budget, it's the job of the federal government to balance the economy. How should I be saying that if I can't use the word budget? Books.
What's that? Balance its books. Balance
its books.
Balance its books.
Actually, that's really good. Thank you. That's exactly what I need.
It's like a spreadsheet.
Problem solved.
But see,
You're welcome.
the point is that you're relating something about government to its fiscal balance. I wouldn't even do that. You're saying it's not the point by saying it's not the job of the government to balance the books. You're making out that the books are somehow, or that balance means anything.
She gets that from me. I've said that 100 times.
Yeah.
So I'm guilty of reinforcing.
Yeah, we're all babes in the wood. What I would say is it's the job of the government to advance well-being and public purpose.
Yeah.
And in a specific area. What's that?
I was just going to say that line works well in response to someone who says to you, we need to balance the budget. Then you say, the job is not to balance the budget, it's balance the economy. You can say it as a retort, but to initiate or to lead with that, I agree.
And then my other question is, and this also I get from you, I try very, very hard not to say the government prints money. Instead, I talk about the government issuing money. Is that how we should be talking about it?
No.
Okay. Exactly the reason for asking.
I would always think, well, what's the context of the conversation? So you're talking about about the government, a local project or something. I'd just say the government has responsibility to use its capacities to do that.
Usually when I'm talking about at that point in time, we will be, for instance, in the U.S. talking about the debt ceiling. You know, I mean, there'll be some, ridiculous neoliberal thing that's the big thing in the news that week, and I'm trying to explain to our listeners why it's a ridiculous conversation to be having at all. And I talk a lot about, we're really talking about pixels. Pixels equal unicorns equal rainbows. They're not a thing. We have infinite pixels.
Yes, so whenever we talk about debt, we're talking about a bad. That's the intrinsic frame. So to reverse that, I always talk about, the debt is somehow expressed as a liability of government, which it is. But it's also our store of wealth. So whenever I talk about public debt, I talk about our wealth, a segment of our wealth. Wealth is a good thing, isn't it, for us to have? Why would you want a government limiting our capacity to create wealth?
Yeah, and I do talk about, if they don't have it in their sector, it's because we have it in our sector.
I've lost track of who had.
Yeah.
So I was just going to say that it's important to notice that on Lakewood, we have two groups of people, right? The people who have the strict father mentality and the nurturing parents. So the strict father, you don't even talk to them. They're gone. You're not going to convince them of anything. Then the nurturing parents is like your friends. So with them you can talk about budget, and they know what you're talking about. That friend who won't be triggered. And then you have bi-conceptuals. Those are the people that we're trying to gain over. So depending on the context and the people that you're talking to, you could definitely use some words. Because if we're sitting together and we talk about government spending, we want that, right? But you're trying to convince someone where you're canvassing out in the suburbs, that's the one you don't want to say that word to.
Yeah, that's true. I think this, and then this, and then this, and then this.
This is very difficult with the public. I don't mean to disagree with anything you said, and I don't mean to suggest that language isn't important. I'm sure it is, but I'm fairly skeptical about Linkoff and all that. He's right. He's only halfway there. And I think when you talk about education, you're talking about the other half. But unfortunately, that's a very difficult other half, because when any of us or somebody with a blog says, "Oh, we should do these things for the people," the immediate question for any person, left or right, is going to be, "Well, how are you going to pay for it?" It's because there's a ton of psychology, and probably for some reason people don't like him, but Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist, said we learn by experience. We're designed to do that, and we pick up experiences very early, and we develop concepts based around them, and frequently they're quite wrong. Like if you growing up, you would think the sun went over the earth, and you wouldn't think that the earth is moving, right? So there was a spinning. So those concepts, those intuitive concepts, are frequently quite wrong, and our view of how the common person, and to educate the people's view of how the economy works, is really quite wrong. But it's based on their own personal experience. So to unwind that is a very difficult thing. And I be brief and just say, I would urge people to look at something that's been around for 25 years. It's a video, a set of videos. And it's easy to remember, really. It's called A Mind of Our Own. And it's science education. And it's studies that show that people used to think that, well, the way you teach science or anything else is people are an empty vessel. And you bring them into the classroom and you fill them with knowledge, and they go out and now they know science. What turns out that people, children, adults, come into the classroom with very strong understandings of how the solar system works and things like that. And much of the effort of science education has to be to work with people, to work through those concepts and make them come to their own realization that that's not correct. It's just the opposite of the way it really works. And that's true for almost all of our scientific breakthroughs, evolution, Copernicus.
Dr. Mitchell just said that.
Yeah, so hold on.
So I do urge that people, if I leave you with nothing else, I urge you to look at that. It's called A Mind of Our Own. And it discusses how teachers can go about unwinding these thoughts.
You more or less
difficult than just
expressed the same opinion earlier. So here's a quiz. How many people in the room 15 or 20 years ago, for those that were everyone, had a essential understanding of any of the basic MMT concepts? Oh, you would have, James, but how many people thought that taxpayers fund government spending? There you go. So look at the progress we've made already.
It's tricky.
It's hard to unload.
Yeah, one of the things I understand is a lot of times people can understand what you're saying, but they can't reconcile it with what they are. That's I tell them that. I said, look, I'll say, okay, if the government, I'll say, if you pay the government cash, they throw it in shred. So I don't understand.
Right.
What do you mean you don't understand? You understand the thing I don't. What you can't do is reconcile it with okay, so they can understand the whole model, but then they can't.
Well, what do we do about that?
Can someone moderate, please?
It's much easier to
So then you work on reconciling it
someone
rather than.
I've got a list of people who've got questions.
Okay, so then you work on reconciling it. Once they understand that, then you need to go and help them reconcile, as opposed to trying to explain how it works.
Okay. You were next.
Thank you, William. I remember that when I read Lakoff, he said that people not vote for their convenience, but they vote because of their values. So if values evoke the way we see the world, and there are two different types of ideas of government, he thought that also there are two different types of families, value families, as he was saying. Like the Orthodox says, oh, we punish the bad, the poor, and the unemployed by taxes, and the nurturing father or the heterodox, we assure the benefits of the people by security, social security or jobs. So my question is that if also language helps to change the way we think, it's enough to change the values that are the most intrinsic thing of the people?
Well, here's an example. I think it's general, but it's Australian. In 1945, after the war, the national government produced a white paper on fault line. And it was a very elaborate statement on what the responsibilities of the federal government were. And it explained to the people that we were going to grow wealth and build infrastructure, rebuild the nation after the war, etc., etc. Not that we were damaged by the war, but to go into the next phase of peacetime development. And all of the media, the academic research programs, it was all reinforcing that frame. And in the period up to the next 30 years, there was hardly any literature on the deficit. Each year the government would produce its, every May the government would have its budget announcement, and all the press and everybody else was concerned about was what would that do to the unemployment rate. And the headlines were always about the unemployment and about that and how well we were growing. And governments would lose their office politically, federal government, if the unemployment rate went anything above 2%, because of the way it was all framed. This era now, the obsession, the deficit's in the paper every day. We've got 15% labour underutilisation, hardly gets a mention. That's underemployment, unemployment and drop in participation rate. Hardly ever gets a mention. Every night on the news, the finance report has something about one of these nasties. And so the point is, it's about framing. Our values have changed because of the way the media and all of the supporting infrastructure frames it. And someone said once that nobody cared about the economy particularly until the news reports each night had a finance report. So my belief is that it's about framing and language. And our intrinsic frames are amenable to that. And if we can, everyone in this room would support a frame that said we want people to have opportunities. And it's how you frame what that means.
And we had a question down here, yes?
If I may,
and you.
Everyone can have 90 seconds to answer the question, or to ask their question. When the 90 seconds hits, I'll ask you to ask your question.
We've got about 4 questions left at the moment. What time is it?
3:43, so we've got about 12 minutes.
Yeah, right. So at the moment there's you, and you. That's my, and there's the 4th.
Yeah, this is just to make sure.
No worries.
So I'll be super quick, but if I could be a little bit brash, I'm on a panel tomorrow morning on MMT Foundations at 10:30, where at the end of my presentation I provide kind of some talking points, if you were, that I think a lot of people might be looking for. And just to give you a little bit of a taste on the affordability question, I guess if I could, in my opinion, in the MMT world, everything pays for itself, okay? Economic growth pays for itself. Full employment pays for itself. Infrastructure pays for itself. Then, if you can get people thinking in those kinds of terms, you can have a larger conversation about money and budgets. But just in terms of a very simple talking point, it pays for itself. That's how it's done.
Yes, I'm going to turn the question to a more elementary stage. This is the first conference I've attended without knowing exactly what the main things are about. That is MMT. Germany has sort of hinted what the subject is, but he didn't explain why everything pays for itself. Can you elaborate on that? What's the economic logic of that?
Hey, Bill, just say quickly, you people in the room can say things, and it's okay and it works, that Bill, myself, and Stephanie can't say. We're held to a different standard, so we're giving you things, but a lot of the things you're saying are working and bringing people in, and they don't expect you to be 100% technically proficient, so we have to be we're in a different situation.
Sorry, you were next. In doing any writing, it's important to figure out first who your audience is. And so if we're talking to ourselves, then, for example, we're talking to ourselves when we're using the term investment, meaning building productive capacity makes sense. But if you're talking to people out there, the people that you want to vote for a policy, a position, right, that's where the power is, then you have to understand, investment for them means getting rich. Because they want to be like Rockefeller, right? And they went for that meaning because they voted for a guy who is rich, but is a fraud. Okay, so they went for it. The second point is, this is Kansas City. There's an area in Kansas City, 3019 Troops, what we would call the inner city. No one in this room, including me, can determine for those people what is good for them. So if we've got any normative, any value statements in this, that has to come from them. And by the way, they are the audience. They're the ones we're trying to convince. So unless we know what they want, then it's going to fall flat. Thirdly, Lakoff may not be right on everything. But when I hear the Democrats say we have a better deal, I think about Trump, not Pelosi and Schumer.
The deal might have.
That's right. They framed it wrong.
Okay, Bill.
Yeah, it's two before you pull on it.
One thing I think that at least I've experienced, because I've been getting my readers sort of down the curve on this, is not to underestimate the dint of repetition. That just even if because I don't think I've used the best framing a lot of times for this, and yet a lot of my readers have come around, and in fact the readers are regularly in the comments section when somebody's saying something orthodox. They'll be the one who've already slapped it down before I even seen the comment. So even so I think there is a significant education on this, that if you've been trained in an orthodox manner, getting MMT sort of like turning the brain inside out, and it just takes a while, even if you're receptive to it, to get your mind around it. The second thing is, I think there may be ways in terms of just even getting people to be willing to consider it, to sort of engage in like orthogonal discussion, where people sort of go down the balanced budget track. One thing that I've done, and again, you might reject this as being not good framing, but is to basically say, do you really like this whole idea that even balance the budget is a myth? we have a huge black budget. Nobody talks about it. They always find the money for the next bombing run in Iraq. Nobody goes to Congress to have that allocated. Where do you think that comes from? The government makes that when they need it. It's weird. The idea, it's like I found that to be successful, but you just attack going.
I think the point about repetition is really important. The readers of my blog are very repetitive. Okay, so we had one. Was it here? Paul, you're two in the queue. Stephanie was next.
No, I think
Paul.
Well, there's a book just out about the letters and correspondence of Diamond Transfer. Everybody should read it. Ken advised Lyndon Johnson and Kennedy about how to make what was progressive economics understandable to the public. And about the deficit, there's a letter that he writes to Kennedy, when he's president. He says, people are going to ask you, why should the government not balance its budget when we think households ought to always balance the budget? And he said, the answer you should give is as follows. If the government does not balance its budget, that will permit all the unemployed households to balance their budget. And don't you want households to balance their budgets? That was the way of putting it in the way for you to understand. You ought to read it because he has for almost everything that we raise nowadays. What amazes me, and I've reviewed the book, so that's why I read it. What amazes me is how Keynes saw things that, I'll give you just one other example. He writes to Bill Clinton as he was president that he ought to write a book about what to do for our presidency, because one of the things we have to worry about is if we elect a president who has no government ability, but has only been an executive in business, because that's going to be a disaster. How do you do about it? I have no idea.
Are there any other questions? James?
Three quick things. If you haven't read the Powell Memo, you should look it up. Because it is a blueprint. That's what Bill mentioned.
The Powell Manifesto. Yeah, right. 1971, the Powell Manifesto by Lewis Powell. He was hired by finance, the fund. Everybody should know about Powell. And he set out a strategic document whereby capital could retain. They were worried about profit squeeze. That was essentially loss of control of the workplace. And he set out a very elaborate strategy that was then implemented over a series of years that really created the work.
The second thing is, there's a perfect language in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution that says that they're supposed to promote the general welfare. And so you have to hold the Congress to its constitutional responsibility. The preamble sets out what the Constitution is supposed to accomplish, and that's one of those things. So that's a good phrase to use.
You've got to link it to a causation.
Right.
Because anybody can say they're good for the American welfare.
But promote the general welfare is. And the first thing is, several years ago, a book was written called Behavior, Control, and Perception. And that book does an awful lot of what Bill is talking about. It was developed by an engineer who understood feedback. And if you're looking for more advanced development of the kind of thing, how do you frame things, and how perceptions get formed, what the control loops look like, and so forth, I would recommend that book.
What's the title again?
Behavior, Code, Control of Perception.
Great, thanks. We've got about time for one more question.
By William Powers.
We've got one here. Sorry.
Just one comment to follow up. Steve Ballmer of Microsoft spent some money to publish a 10K for the United States. It's got balance sheets, and it derives its purposes from the preamble to the Constitution. So for some audiences, I think it might be a persuasive intro to MMT.
Okay, that was quick. So.
Quick thought, if we're talking about framing this, I think the use of the word progressive, if we want to reach the right, progressive is going to be a bridge too short. I think we alienate many ideologues on the other side by using that word. Is there another way to frame it so that we can get this tool in the hands of government and then maybe address the agenda separately?
Well, let's workshop it through the internet and email. Yeah. Okay, so
there's Ralph Nader's Unstoppable, where he talks about bridging.
Okay, it's very hot in here. Thanks very much for coming.